Good morning. Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom Aleichem.
Welcome to 10 Minutes of Torah. I think there's a real turning point in the dynamic of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, between full-blown presence of God and the way that plays out vis-a-vis the sense of separateness or self-awareness on behalf of the Jewish people. From the moment of Sinai, you could see that there's a very delicate balance being struck to try and fine-tune the nature of the relationship between the divine and the human. It's tricky. God is, as we know, speaking theologically, is infinite and a very overwhelming presence, for lack of a better term. The humanity, or the human consciousness is just that. Limited, finite, and vulnerable.
Okay.
Extremely vulnerable in the relationship.
Yeah.
There's humanity is at a distinct disadvantage in the relationship, in the balance of power. And it's very difficult to talk about a relationship when the proportion of power in the relationship is so lopsided.
We were created.
And so the question is, what does God want? And that's really his call. And you see this being played out at another level in this week's portion. It's almost as if we scratch at the surface a little, we can get a sense of a conflict, obviously speaking metaphorically and anthropomorphically, within the desire of God himself. On one hand, there's a divine plan, and that includes engaging this humanity that he created to be sort of a human extension of the divine consciousness, which is something that tickles God's fancy, and that's why he created the world and did this all.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, how far is God willing to go in terms of granting that independence to people, to humanity, to human consciousness, and then seeing how they are prepared to work their way back to God, truly of their own volition. And right now, God is saying, I want you to be in a relationship with me. But God still doesn't see truly the human consciousness as separate from him. And so it's more of a theoretical relationship. There's more of a theoretical I and thou, but not an actual thou. It's more of a thou that is very much still wrapped up within God's own selfhood. And it's a very primitive form of a relationship. It has the outlines of a relationship, but in order to have a real relationship, for example, in the human sphere, there has to be two autonomous, separate human beings that choose to come together. If at any point one of them is in a position where they have to forfeit their selfhood in order to be in this relationship, then it's not the ideal relationship. And a great way of capturing
Between
this
people, now you're talking.
between
Two
people.
people.
And Eric Fromm captures this very powerfully in The Art of Love, where he emphasizes the importance of, in a human relationship,
Right.
for the autonomy of each individual and the freedom and the selfhood, and two people granting self boundaries. The boundaries, they're not just one entity that merges. You know, that might be a very romanticized version of love and romance. Is, you know, he swept her off her feet,
Right.
you know, or I'm falling in love.
Yeah.
But in both of those very popular
Yeah.
descriptions of love, the shared common theme is someone is off their feet and someone has fallen.
And someone swept, and
Yeah.
someone did the.
Exactly. And then someone is standing, and you have to step back and say, is this what love is? It's a seduction, and there has to be an element of seduction in every relationship, but that can't be the
Yeah.
ongoing
Right.
definitive characteristic of the relationship, because it's not a relationship. And so this week's portion, in many ways, is a turning point in the dynamic where God says, if I want to truly have a relationship
Yeah.
with an other, I have to grant them that otherness. And when God tells Moses, Shlach lecha, send spies out to check out the land of Israel, symbolically, it's a huge shift in the very, let's look at the words. Shlach is a command.
Right.
So God says, do it. But then the second word is lecha. You do it. I'm telling you to do it, but it's
For you.
and the commentaries right away say shlach lecha ledatecha. You need to construct this, and it was a reconnaissance mission
Yeah.
to see if the land of Israel is able to be settled, and could they create an agrarian culture over there, and B, if they could conquer the land.
Right.
And so God could have easily said, hey, you saw what I did to the Egyptians. What do you care? What are you worried about? I'll just go in and 10 plagues that place
Well,
up and down. and I'll throw in a few, splitting of seas, and he's a shock and awe, right?
Blow them away.
But it's suddenly shifting, and God is withdrawing his overwhelming power and subcontracting the power lecha, to you. Right there's a big shift in the nature of the relationship. And the root of all human relationships, certainly from a Kabbalistic standpoint, is rooted in the relationship that we can glean, the characteristics of the relationship between the human and the divine. And the way that we can explore the dynamics of the relationship between the human and the divine, the shifts, the moderating touches, the tweaking and the tuning, is essentially a evolving relationship where there's a sudden sensitivity to the need of the other party in the relationship to feel like they're on their feet. To take away the element of seduction and to replace it with a consciousness.
It has to sustain, though, too.
Correct.
It has to sustain. Sometimes the seduction,
Right,
it's not always sustainable.
And Stephen Covey has a very world-famous book called Seven Habits of a Successful. I don't know who knows what that's called. Anyone out there know what it's called? Of a successful person, and he explores. He lays out 3 paradigms. An original paradigm,
Right.
like in the development of a human being, is dependence, because a child is dependent on the parent, on the mother, on the father, and then there's a point of rebellion, independence, and it's an extreme where I want to establish I'm my own person, and the parent, if the parent has the wisdom and the das to see it, not take it personally, and to resist the urge to be, the helicopter parent, then they'll step back and they'll say, Shlach lecha.
Right.
You go figure out how to conquer Israel, how to make your way into the promised land. And you do it. And so it's very much of an extreme.
Right.
Now, granted, the parent who's the helicopter parent in this case can't go to the extreme and be a non-parent.
Right.
And similarly, God withdrawing, so to speak, metaphorically, from the foreground doesn't mean that God is disappearing. It's not the death of God, it's the shift from overwhelming seduction, coercion, to over the top, to you go figure out how to make this work. And it's empowering, and obviously the first flirtation with self-determination can be overwhelming and intoxicating and lead one to make mistakes. And that's exactly what happened in this week's portion. After the spies came back, the Jewish people said, we're going to go and conquer. And God says, you're not ready yet. And of course, that didn't go very well. But there is another option. There's the submarine parent is the one that goes underground but has the periscope up, and the child feels independent, but the parent is watching from a distance, always watching. That's a sign of love, is where your presence has been, so to speak, diminished, but your love and your desire to interact has not in any way been impacted.
Yeah.
And so I guess you could say that in this moment, in this biblical moment, God makes the transformation from helicopter God to submarine God, or at least begins the process of doing that. And I think that's why it's very, very striking that seemingly out of the blue, Joshua, whose name was Hosea, right here has this theophoric addition of two letters of God to his name.
Not unlike Sarah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Hosea becomes Yehoshua.
Hashem, be good.
So what is that?
I like that.
In many ways, just a couple of verses after God says, you do it, he reinforces that sense of self in the most beautiful way by granting that autonomy, but then stealthily inserting himself into Hosea's name so that his presence becomes buried in his name, symbolizing and signifying the paradoxical nature of presence and absence that is the backbone of a relationship, where he says, you are your own person, but buried in your name is my name. And so when people call your name, they're calling you. But I'm there, under the surface. I have been morphed into your identity, but I'm there. So suddenly God is present in a entirely, radically different form. He's there, but he's there as you. And it's extremely empowering, and at the same time it can be a trap, because the granting of autonomy is a vulnerability that says, if I'm my own person and I'm free to choose, I might not choose you. And
The person, you mean, not God.
correct, and
The person might.
And what's being said is, I'm replacing my seduction with faith that the relationship is grounded sufficiently that we don't have to wow each other to love each other.
Like that.
There's a depth, a previously invisible, not yet visible depth that's now one can sense in the relationship, where it's not determined by the one party overwhelming the other. It's determined through commitment and a love that is grounded in trust. What happens when we don't have trust? We become enforcers. We become controlling because we don't want to lose something. But if the element of fear is taken out of the picture,
Right.
and substituted with trust, suddenly the possibility of a real relationship surfaces. And that's really what's happening over here. God is turning to the Jewish people and saying, okay, you can be a lacha, you can be a you, and we'll still be okay. And it takes time, because the moment they are a you and they go outside the framework of the relationship, God goes crazy. And he says, I'm destroying you all. And what does Moses say? Hold on a second. Settle down. This is a new paradigm.
Yeah.
If you grant autonomy for real, you have to be prepared for the possibility of rebellion.
Oh, they can't handle it.
Or it's not real anymore.
Right.
And so
It was risky.
that's where God says, okay, I'm not destroying them. I'm not destroying them. And that's ironically where the notion of teshuvah was born. Because teshuvah is essentially the equalizer and the formula that restores the equilibrium between the powerful and the powerless. So a lot to think about today, but the take-home point is that this is a portion that grants us tremendous power in the context of a relationship, and it's not the freedom, it's not granting us the freedom to be rebellious, it's granting us the freedom to deepen the relationship in the most powerful way. Yom Tov.
Yom Tov.